Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, somewhere in transition to the Groundwork podcast, somewhere actually quite soon. I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and it is such a pleasure to be together today, exploring the threads of what it means to be humans woven into this earth together. And that last piece is really the core part of today's episode, which is incredibly near and dear to my heart. In today's episode, I sit down with author Kurt Gray to discuss his new book, Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality and Politics. And I want to read you the dust jacket explanation of this before I get into a little bit of my personal story about why I decided to bring Kurt on, just so you can kind of get an idea about where we're going, which is in Outraged. Kurt Gray presents groundbreaking science showing that liberals and conservatives share the same moral mind. Everyone's moral judgments stem from feeling threatened or vulnerable to harm. Drawing on original research, Gray offers a new explanation for moral outrage and explores how to bridge divides. If you want to understand the morals of, quote, the other side, ask yourself a simple question. What harms do they see? And in this, Kurt and I go really deep into some evolutionary biology and how the environment in which our minds developed in as humans, as herd animals, were really ones where we were prey, and how that shaped how we see the world. And when you fast forward to today, when we're in a very different mismatched environment, we are still looking for those harms. And when you add social media to the equation, this just becomes a really interesting milieu to create a lot of outrage. And I think that we're in some ways, a more divisive climate than ever. And I kind of want to go a little bit back to a little bit more of a personal detail about why I wanted to bring this book on, which, to be frank, I think should be required reading. It surprised me how much I learned about myself and how I see the world, as well as sort of the collective and what we're experiencing as we look out on the world. And I even learned some that didn't have to do with politics and just the way that I respond to a variety of stimuli in the world. And so this was sort of a bit of a self-growth moment for me as well. And I think that whether or not you're looking to have conversations across the divide, this book does help explain some of how you react to certain things. And since reading the book, I've really taken note of how I react and respond when I open my news app or when I see something on social media, and just better understanding that process internally, even if I'm not applying it to this idea of bridging divides. And I want to say at the outset too, and I think Kurt and I mentioned this, Kurt's really funny. And some of the examples that he gives in the book provide a sense of fantastic levity. And he has a great sense of humor that I think adds something a little bit lighter to what is really a heavy conversation. And, you know, when I started my career, I was in my very early 20s and had walked into agriculture pretty unknowingly from the world of academia. And I was immediately confronted by a lot of people that thought very differently than me in many different ways. And I'm really grateful for that experience because it made it, in that sort of nascent early stage, made it just kind of a foregone fact that I would be working with people that thought differently than me, and really helped me learn how to sit down with them, especially over what was really, when I started in agriculture and food, a very bipartisan issue. And I actually think that over the last decade or so, it's become increasingly more partisan. And I'm always reflective that on the podcast, there are a lot of divides that we're trying to bridge here, whether that's rural and urban, whether that's, ways of thinking about agriculture or environmentalism or conservation or anything like that, and really discussing how to build community, knowing that it's a somewhat, and I love Jill Winger said this on an episode, right? It's a messy process to build community. And some of that messiness is us coming together over common causes, but from very different frameworks. And I think that this is important work. And whether you choose to embark on this work or these hard conversations, I don't want this podcast to feel prescriptive. I want it to feel curious and exploratory for you, right? This isn't my prescription. I'm not saying that you have to have these conversations by any means. I'm just sharing that in my experience, it's been really incredible to have these conversations and to have a network that spans a lot of different belief systems. And I think that for so many of us that are just a part of the exhausted majority, that there is this deep desire to come together in some way, to bridge those divides in some way, and how to be better bridges when we want to, and find depth with people, which is something that Kurt and I explore as well, is just how much deep questions can change our enjoyment of the conversation and of one another, and find that sense of humanity, right? That we really do all have in common, that we all experience grief, we all experience joy, we all worry about our children, we're all concerned about the harms that might befall us. And even that is a basis for just what we have in common. And so just by asking what harm are they seeing, right? It can really diffuse the situation. I think Kurt provides some incredible resources, and I do want to say at the outset, we talk at the very end that, and this will all be in the show notes, that there are some guides if you purchase the book for having these conversations. I also link to the John Saruf guide for talking politics through what is essential. Kurt has the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding and his Deepest Beliefs lab that can be incredible resources for these conversations. And I enjoyed this podcast so thoroughly. And I will say I was really nervous to talk to Kurt. And this podcast was really important to me. It was really interesting. My husband and I actually listened to this book on walks together, and he rarely wants to listen to my nonfiction realms. And we so enjoyed getting to listen to it together and to have these kind of conversations in real time. And I think it made for even better listening, and made this podcast episode even more important to me. Kurt was kind enough to go on a big side quest with me that I just want to briefly touch base on, which was around paradox. There are a lot of paradoxes featured in the book, and if you've been a long-time listener, you'll know that I love paradox and have explored it on multiple different episodes. But I did want to give a definition to listeners in case it's not a concept that you're familiar with. And I found I liked this definition from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which said that a paradox is a statement or group of statements that leads to a contradiction or a situation which defies intuition or common sense. Paradoxes often challenge established norms of reasoning, inviting new interpretations of logical consistency. And I think for me, this really tugged at that whenever there is paradox, it kind of forces us to expand our understanding of the relationships between two things, to find a sort of deeper well of what happens not in an either or context, but in a both and context. For my science nerds out there, light is both a wave and a particle would be sort of foundational scientific paradox that I think offers us a way into understanding complexity, right? And we're always teasing at that on the podcast. How do we better understand complexity? And we are complex beings, and we exist in a world that is shifting, I think, rather rapidly. And the ground that we stand on individually and with one another is shifting rapidly, and we're all just trying to find our place. And I just have a lot of big love for all of us in going through that process. And I'm really grateful for Kurt and this book, and exploring how, if we want to, we can maybe invite these deeper conversations. And invitation is definitely part of his civil conversation framework. It's the I in civ. And I'm just really excited for you here to hear this episode. I'm really grateful to our sponsor, REDMOND Real Salt, who I think is doing an incredible job of building community right in Utah. And through the link in the show notes or using the code mindbodysoil_15, you can get 15% off their products so you can have more salty conversations. And with that, I want to turn this over to Kurt, and I really hope you enjoy this episode, and grateful to Kurt for his time. Actually, so two things at the front here, which is I've so thoroughly enjoyed preparing this episode. My husband rarely gets on board with listening to the books that I'm exploring with me, and we actually listened to this one together on walks and in the kitchen while we were cooking, and really enjoyed the conversation that ensued. And I really feel it should be required reading for all of us. And I'm really appreciative of the effort that you put in. It was compelling. It was fun. Your examples brought some fun and some levity into it that we deeply appreciated. And so thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you liked it. And I do think it's important. And I do think it's important not to take yourself so seriously when writing about serious issues, because there's a lot of heaviness today.
Yeah.
And so we can learn without being depressed.
Yeah. And I felt that. I felt your levity. And I thought I'd actually open, if it's all right with you, with how I found out about your book to begin with, which won't feel relevant, but it will actually dovetail really neatly into kind of the first part of the book around being a prey animal. So I was sitting at dinner with a group of people that included Ben Klutze, who you did an episode with on the book. And I was telling this story, which I'll tell here really briefly, which is I raise goats. And my husband had been out of town for the better part of 2 years. And in a very rural space, I feel very isolated. And I had this little bottle baby goat, and her and I had laid down to take a nap in the shade one afternoon. And all the other goats were out quite a ways off, just grazing and foraging for grass. And when I woke up from the nap, our alpha goat, who kind of leads the pack, was standing watch over us. And I was really touched on a lot of different levels, but it was very profound in how much it made me feel a sense of safety from threat as a herd animal. And my goats give me a lot of basis for reflecting on both economics and human sociality. But I really felt protected. And so I had told this story at dinner, and Ben said, "You have to read this book." And so I wondered if we might open with talking a little bit about humans as prey animals and how that creates our perception of the world. And I'll just let you know that our listeners have a decent basis in evolutionary biology, so I think they'll catch on quick.
Great. Yeah, and I love that story. I also just love the idea of an alpha goat. There's something written about alpha males, and it's just like, no, it's just this is the alpha goat, and like
Mhm.
it's not trying to be tough. It's just looking over the
Yeah.
herd.
What's interesting too is he's actually a castrated male. He's actually a wether, not a buck.
Oh
Um,
wow, okay.
yeah, I don't know.
So it just goes to show, anyone could be an alpha.
Mhm.
Um, that's great. Well, I'm a social psychologist. I'm not a, evolutionary biologist or an anthropologist. But as I kind of studied and ran studies about how our minds work and what morality means within our minds and its basis, I thought about the kind of common wisdom in the fields and in society that like we're apex predators, right? Like we all walk around like thinking that we're apex predators, and you go to museums and there's dioramas of like the cave people with the spears and eating mammoths, and the more I learned and the more I thought about those things, the more I thought, there's no way that this is actually how we evolved. And the thing that really cemented it for me was watching Planet Earth with my kids, the new Planet Earth
Yeah.
documentary. And there's a scene where there's a water buffalo in the Serengeti pretty close to after it rains. And so it's standing in, I don't know, a couple feet of water. And there's like 3 lionesses that are trying to bring this thing down. And they just can't, because it's like the water's a little too deep, and they have huge claws and huge fangs, and the water buffalo is like bleeding, and it's kind of bucking it off. And in the end, the lionesses just get tired, they give up, and then the water buffalo kind of trots away,
Wow.
covered in blood, but still alive because its hide is so thick.
Yeah.
And I just thought, if 3 killing machines, these lionesses, couldn't bring down a water buffalo, and then you imagine like, scrawny, hairless apes with like sharpened sticks.
Ooh, pathetic.
Yeah, there's no way.
Yeah.
There's no way. And so supporting this kind of intuition, right, of watching this was kind of my own personal experiences from being trapped in the wilderness, ages ago, but also the anthropological evidence that I got to, which is, all the evidence out there really shows that we are much more prey than we thought. If you look carefully, right, like our kids were eaten by eagles. Like imagine going outside with your kids and you like look and like, and then the kid's gone. And so just so much evidence that we were more prey than predators. And it really kind of changed how I thought about, who we are in human nature.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if you can bring us into how that changes the way that we perceive and register threat, both then, but especially now.
Yeah, right. So then everything was threatening, terrifying in the midst of time, right? Like wild animals, like the dark was just terrifying, right?
Yeah.
Because big cats can see in the dark, we cannot. And so you were just like, straining our ears in the darkness, sleeping with our family, just waiting for big cats to kind of eat, our kids. And today, still, like kids are terrified of the dark. You have to look under their beds,
Yeah.
because we're so fixated on
It's a very
threat.
primordial fear. And I mean, having been in the woods in the dark by myself, it still, as an adult, comes up.
Yeah, and with good reason. There was this pop singer who got eaten by coyotes in Canada like a decade ago. She was out for a jog.
Wow.
Rare, but
But still can happen. Yeah. And we are still prey.
exactly. And so today, we're much safer from wild animals, but we still have this hardwired sense of prey, and we still see threats everywhere. So a dark alley you might walk down, or the example I like is like, imagine your kids are playing outside, you live in a suburban neighborhood, and you see this white panel van drive like slowly up the street and then back down the street, and most likely lost locksmith. But you don't think that.
No.
Right? You're like predator. Not,
Yes.
not an animal predator, but
No,
like,
but
a child predator.
yes.
And so we're fixated on threats today, on kind of like political threats, moral threats, right? Human predators. And I think when we fail to recognize like the power of threats, one, we just fail to recognize like how easy it is to kind of influence us. Think of like
Yes.
political propaganda always focuses on threats, right? The local news, cable news is always about threats. But two, I think it's hard for us to remember that people who disagree with us have the same minds and the same concerns, right? Like, everyone knows that they vote for protection, right? We want to protect your values, protect our kids, protect society. But when we think of the other side, we have what I call as the destruction narrative, and we think that the other side is like just trying to burn it all down, like they're hunting us, like they're the predators. But they're terrified too, right? Like, and I'm talking, let me just say right now, I'm like talking about the 99% of people who are not psychopaths and the 99% of people, right, who are everyday
Certainly.
people.
Yes.
Trying to
Yes.
get through
We're
the
talking
world.
about the general. Yes.
Exactly. And so most people are feeling like prey, and so when we project the kind of predator status on them, I think it's wrong, right? And it's that kind of misconception about the other side, because we feel like prey, we assume they must be predators, but they think of us as the predators and them as the prey, right? So I think that's a huge misconception that really drives kind of political disagreement and makes it worse.
Yeah, I love that. And you give such beautiful examples in the book of how this sort of theory of the mind of others, how our perception of the mind of others affects the way that we behave even within. And I think really salient for me, and I've heard you talk about this, it was a very lasting excerpt, but the math problems, that when we view the other side's narrative as being a threat, we become worse at math.
That's right. Yeah, I love that study. Right.
It's so great.
Right. I mean, both sides thinks that the other side is stupid. And in some sense, everyone's right, because we do get stupid when we're presented with evidence, mathematical evidence, that runs counter to our political views, right? Everyone's actually equally good as math, liberals, conservative. But when you're presented with information, kind of like a complicated problem about, like, are concealed guns, do they help make us safe, or do they hurt us more? And so there's some researchers at Yale who gave this problem to people, and it was a little complex. You had to compare fractions.
And it was a word problem,
it was a word problem, right? So, right, the stuff that the kids are learning now in the new math, right, but it remains challenging, especially for grown-ups who haven't been in school for a while. You got to kind of synthesize. And it turns out that people were generally good when the math problem, this problem, was like separated from politics, used kind of neutral language. But as soon as the problem was about, guns and gun control or gun rights, then people just were like, well, it's complicated, but I'm sure it supports, my perspective. And they kind of fudge the numbers. So we're all kind of like, math cheaters in a sense. We all get blind to statistics when it comes to our political convictions.
I hope you're enjoying this episode with Kurt Gray and his new book, out now, Outraged. I want to take a minute to talk about one of our incredible sponsors of the show for a long time, which is REDMOND Real Salt. REDMOND Real Salt has been a staple in my kitchen for over 7 years. This salt isn't just for flavor. It's packed with 60 plus trace minerals from an ancient seabed mined right here in the USA in Utah. With every pinch, I can kind of taste the earth itself, and maybe it's having visited, but it's complex and rich and certainly salty, but it's also just a touch sweet. And I really believe that this is more than just salt. It's a nutrient. And for me, it's often the only thing I use to season my food. Whether it's the kosher, coarse, or fine varieties, REDMOND brings out the true flavors of the food grown right here in my local food shed. As spring rounds the bend, I know I'm about to pickle ramps with it, add a little bit of fresh nettle tea, and use it to bring out flavor in those first greens of spring, which is why I always buy the big 25-pound bag, so I always have it on hand. And remember, this isn't just about flavor, right? Our bodies need salt and trace minerals to fuel our muscles, our cellular processes, and yes, probably our emotional systems too, as we process these hard conversations. As it heats up and I'm starting to sweat in the garden and on the trail, I also turn to Relight electrolyte hydration powder from REDMOND Real Salt to keep me energized during my long farm days or workouts. You can grab 15% off your order at redmond.life using the code mindbodysoil_15. I really believe that this is a simple way to nourish yourself inside and out, and having visited with REDMOND in Utah, I know that they are also all about building community, which I love. Now, back to our episode with Kurt. Yeah, I mean, I thought that that was really profound, and I think that there was so much in the book to me that was it was twofold, honestly. I was surprised at how much I took away sort of at a personal micro individual level about the way that I think and operate in the world. But then how much I took away about how we as a species, as the human animal, operate with one another in the world. And I think a big part of that was being able to get into, or at least attempt to, since we never can, get into the mind of the other and to have that experience. I wasn't going to bring this in this early, but since we're here, one of the things that I really want to tease out during our chat is we've talked a lot about story on the podcast, and that us as humans are very much a storytelling animal. And I thought it was really profound at the end. You have this discussion about how story over statistics can really be something that bridges our divides. And you gave this beautiful example of people telling the story from the perspective of the other
Mm.
in the first person, and just how profound it was. So maybe we'll go there. I had that towards the end, but I think that this might be a good time.
Sure. I mean, you want me to just talk about the narrative 4 example?
Yeah, I think talk about that example and how we can better understand the side of the other, and how hard it is too to get out of our own little bubble of our perception.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I think it actually goes really well with this idea of humans as prey and concerned about protection, because I think that's the thing that we really fail to appreciate about the other side, right? Like, you know that you're afraid of this policy or this change that's happening in America or your state, but you think that the other side, again, is not afraid, and they're trying to, like, burn it all down.
Yeah, that
And so,
destruction narrative.
exactly. Like, there's some supervillain, Marvel supervillain, that just wants to, like, watch the world burn, but no one wants to watch the world burn. And so I think the way that we need to kind of move forward and see the other side as not demons, but human beings, is to recognize that they too are worried about protection and that they're afraid. But that's hard to do when you're afraid, right? Like, you think they're the enemy and you're the victim. And when, like, you're convinced that you're the victim, it's hard to see anyone else as a victim too, right? Because it's so self-focused. And this is where kind of stories really come in, especially stories when someone tells you not a talking point from the radio or from social media, but really like, look, this is my experience, right? So I felt really afraid. So think about guns again, right? If I'm pro gun control, and I am kind of gun control, I grew up in Canada, right? There's no handguns there. And if someone tells me, look, the reason that I am pro-gun rights is because one time when I was a kid, my mom used a gun to defend our family from a home intruder. And there are thousands and thousands of people who have a story just like that.
Yeah.
And so on one hand, you're like, well, there's statistics, that argue that, like, guns can be dangerous, but, like, for that person, their truth is their personal experience and their past. And so that makes me really realize, on a personal note, that they're motivated to protect themselves, and that's why they care about gun ownership, because of this protection.
Yeah, and I was struck in the book, you talk about how we assume that facts are going to be what bridges that divide, or what gets people to see the other perspective, but that's really not particularly true, that it is this more personal connection of story.
Yeah, because facts are important. I'm a scientist, I operate in facts.
Yes.
And facts are what kind of fuel the economy, and right, like, facts are so amazing in so many ways. But our moral convictions are not really in the same domain as facts, right? Like, I ask folks often to think about a disagreement or an argument they had about morality, and then to think about when someone gave them some statistic or fact that they heard on NPR or Fox News, right, or social media, and then what did they do? Were they like, oh my goodness, that's such a great statistic, you're right, I'm wrong about abortion, I'm wrong about immigration, I guess I'll just change my view? It never happens, right? You never give up your convictions based on facts. Although the funny thing is you think that they will, right? You're like this is gonna nail it, right? Like they're gonna change their beliefs because of this thing I heard, and it never happens because like facts are things like what's the most reliable car I should get, or like how does photosynthesis work, right? Those are not moral things, but when it comes to morality, there the truth is like deeper, it's more personal. And so, of course, personal stories seem to matter more than this kind of like distant, impartial facts.
Yeah, I love that actually. And I think that that speaks to so many of these issues are deeply complex. And I think that story is a bridge for complexity. And I wonder if we might just touch back at the beginning of this conversation of story, which is that even just the experience of telling the story in the perspective of the other and how much that can drop you into oh no, seeing the opinion of the other side, and in the book you tell this story of again it comes back to gun control, and this gentleman, I was it two men?
I was a Todd Underwood,
Yeah,
who's pro gun rights. He runs a big gun sales website. He sold the gun that killed Trayvon Martin. And Carolyn Tuft, whose daughter was murdered in a mass shooting,
yeah,
and she's obviously anti-gun, she's pro-gun rights, or
yeah.
sorry, pro-gun control.
And you tell this story about they switch perspectives. They tell the story in the I perspective from one another, and how impactful that is for Todd in particular. And and that really struck me that even going a step further to get in the shoes of, this other can really have a deeper effect on us and on the stories that we tell.
Right, and because pain is such a private emotion
Mhm.
usually, right? It can be so hard to really put yourself in the shoes of someone else who's suffering. I mean, you look at them, you might see their face, you might hear the words, but their pain is really off limits in a kind of like deep philosophical sense to you, right? Like you can kind of
It
recognize that
is.
someone's suffering, right? But like you can't feel it. And so this story exchange where you tell the story as if it was happening to you using I instead of you, it really lets you feel that pain, right?
Mm.
At the end of this story, Todd Underwood is crying because he's talking about his daughter being murdered in this mass shooting, right? And like he can then recognize that suffering in Carolyn as genuine because he can feel it himself. And so I think that's a powerful way, this is an empathy building exercise, but a powerful way to kind of understand the moral positions of others is saying, look, you're not just making up these like ideas of suffering, right? You're actually feeling them, and
Yeah.
recognizing the genuineness of each other's desire for protection or fear, I think
Yeah.
is really essential.
I hope you're enjoying this episode with Kurt Gray and his new book, Outraged, out now. I want to give thanks to one of the affiliates of the show. I'm talking about Field cast iron pans and their smooth bottoms, lightweight, and vintage quality cast iron feel. I've been using a Field pan for over 5 years, and it's become an essential part of my kitchen. Their cast iron feels like vintage because of their unique foundry process, which is all done right here in the USA, using recycled iron. They machine out the bottom of their pans, which means it's smooth and makes seasoning it all the easier, though best seasoning is just to cook in it all that you possibly can. But it also means that these pans are lighter while they still have that generational quality of vintage cast iron that you know is going to last you a lifetime and your children a lifetime too. This spring, I've been roasting chickens in some of their larger pans. I have this two-handled pan that I fit 4 chickens in the other day, braising meat in their Dutch oven, and just loving the feel of this cookware. Not to mention, cast iron isn't coated, so you get none of the chemicals that come with nonstick pans, which is something we're going to be looking at in an upcoming episode. Field Pan is offering 10% off when you go to the link in my show notes or fieldcompany.com/Kate_Kavanaugh. You get 10% off and get ready to experience how cast iron can make your cooking feel responsive and connected. I hope you're enjoying this episode with Kurt, and let's get back to it. Yeah, those feelings of protection was something I was thinking about when you were talking about that. I actually, since you bring up pain, I really want to get into the vulnerability paradox. But before we do that, I wonder if you'd entertain a slight side quest from me, because I think you might have an interesting take on a question that this book brought up, but that I have in general. And it's a little off topic, but not really. So whenever I'm reading and there's a lot of mention of paradox or there's a lot of implicit paradox, it always really gets me excited. I think that paradox is a really exciting situation. As I read the book, you talk about a lot of paradoxes. You talk about this sort of called it the safety paradox, but you talk about the Tocqueville paradox. I know that you considered naming your prior book the zombie paradox.
Right.
And then there's the vulnerability paradox, which I want to come back around to. But what I was thinking about as humans, and I guess I have this question is there's a lot of either or thinking showcased in the book and how we fall into this sort of villain or victim or you know all these different either or contrasted situations. And what I love about paradox is, to me, it indicates that there's a both and a continuum in between them, right? We can be both light and a particle. And I just wondered if you had from a social psychology basis, why we fall into either or thinking when I think so much of what it is to be human is sort of paradoxical.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, and I too love thinking of paradox. And there's so much paradox in the world. I talk about the paradox of pluralism too, right? Like we want a
Hmm.
society where people can have different views, but some people, their view is to be anti-pluralism and to destroy democracy. And so,
Yeah.
like, do they belong, right? And it's like really hard to wrap our heads around these things. And so, I think the answer is ultimately the human mind is not really built for entertaining the vastness of complexity and the nuances of the world, right? It's for making fast, good enough decisions that keep us alive and that prioritize our survival and the survival of our tribe and our people at the expense of others, like
Yeah.
at the end of the day. It doesn't have to be that now for sure, but I think for a long time it was. And so I think, sitting down with a Zen koan kind of blows our mind because we so rapidly categorize things because that's what's required for us to live, like friend or
Yeah.
foe. Like that's
Yeah.
important to know, right?
Yeah.
Poison or edible.
Yeah. I was going to say food or predator.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And if you stand and think about, right, like, I don't know, like, is this person really a friend or foe? Or is this really a predator or not? Like, let me get closer and see if I can scratch its chin. And does it like it or does it try to eat me? And then you're dead.
Yeah.
So, and I think it takes bandwidth, takes mental bandwidth and time to really appreciate these things. I think there's a reason that, to go back to like Zen, like the people who really entertain these koans are like monks.
Yeah. I was
Literally, their
about to
job
say
is just sitting
sit
and
and
thinking.
think. Yeah.
Yeah, for their whole life. You
Yeah.
know, like what happens if you like there's like a single working mom who's like working two jobs to put food on the table, and you're like, do you ever think about like the paradox of like being and like you are a mind but we're not a mind, it's like all these things. It's like it's hard to think about. You need the time and you need the space.
Yeah. I mean, thank you. That was a fantastic answer to what I know was a question that isn't contained in the book, but also felt a little implicit to me as I kind of noted so many of these paradoxes, both explicit and sort of implicit. And I think that one of them, and I'll dovetail into the vulnerability paradox here, but one that you didn't explicitly state was that with stories, we're telling ourselves stories about the other side and about the other and about how they think and about how they feel. And those stories actually prevent us from entering into the vulnerability of sharing our own story, which, as it turns out, is one of the best way to sort of bridge these divides. And I thought about this in terms of the prey animal too, right? That our perception of threat as prey animals is part of what makes us see these greater divides and perceive the other side as a threat. And it is our sociality and cooperation and communication as prey animals that brought us as humans to where we are today. And so some of the trickiness in that, but I wonder if we might hit on that vulnerability paradox that I think we kind of got at earlier, and just what it is and how important it is.
Sure, yeah. And I think later too we can talk about, I mean, the paradox of like trying to understand when people think that that's betrayal, and like is trying to understand someone who disagrees with us, is that like agreeing with them? Does it tacitly
Ooh,
make us
yes.
immoral? In this current political moment, I get that question a lot. Like, if I have a conversation with someone who disagrees with me, am I like, stamping their views with approval? And so I think that's something that
Oh,
is another paradox.
I would love to touch on that, and if it feels easier, if you want to go right into that, we can. I mean, I'm happy to be a little nimble. That's very interesting to me.
Yeah, maybe let's start with that, and then we go because I think this paradox is important to so folks, listeners can think like, well, I can have conversations, and I'm not an evil person for doing so. And then maybe the vulnerability paradox is like, well, how do you get to those conversations?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's perfect. And this gets at something that I love bridging. I've worked in agriculture for the last 15 years, which tends to really span a wide
Right.
political spectrum. And I've always deeply appreciated having been kind of pushed into that situation. But I think about this and what it means to try to understand somebody's side. Is that the same as sort of approving or endorsing?
Right, right. And it does feel like a little bit like a paradox, right? So,
Yeah.
I run the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding, and at the core, it's like understanding the kind of basic core morality of others. And that means really granting them this idea that like other people who disagree with you are still good moral people in their heart of hearts.
Yeah.
But people can sometimes feel, especially in today's moment, that having a conversation and trying to understand where someone's coming from, like why they voted differently, is like acknowledging that like, no, voting differently, like that's the right thing to do. And I agree with that. But there is a difference between understanding and agreement, right? And you can even validate, this is part of the how to have these conversations, but you can validate someone's opinion and say, look, I understand why you feel that way. I understand how you're trying to protect your family. I disagree maybe with the way you're going about it because of other things, but at the end of the day, I understand that like you're a human being who's trying their best.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a betrayal, because I do think fundamentally they're good people. But even if, you just have pragmatic concerns of like, well, how can I, bring others alongside with me and help them see where I'm coming from? To do that, you have to meet people where they are. You
Yeah.
can't just be like, well, everything you know is wrong and you're a bad person, and then be like, what do you think of my stuff, right? They're gonna have the same view of you that you do of them. And
Mm.
so if you approach them with understanding and some expectation of empathy, then they will do the same to you. And I think that's how you move forward. So I don't
Yeah.
think it's betrayal to understand.
I think this is actually really exemplified by Daryl Davis's work, who you talk
All right.
about in the
Yeah.
book. I mean, yeah, I've seen him speak, and I mean, and I'll let you share a little bit about this because I think it's a really salient example of somebody trying to understand the other side and bridging that divide.
Yeah. And right, he's the perfect example and just an amazing person. Right. So people often ask me, like, look, why should I talk to someone who like disagrees with my fundamental beliefs? And other folks will say, well, why should I talk to someone who doesn't like who I am, right? Who stands against who I am as a person, right? So maybe a trans person is like, why should I talk to a conservative who's kind of like anti-trans?
Yeah.
And my answer is, you shouldn't have to. Absolutely, it's your choice. You shouldn't feel threatened. But here's an example of someone who does, Daryl Davis, and it just yields amazing benefits, I think, for society. And so Daryl Davis is a black man, a blues musician, and he's made it his life's work to talk to KKK members whose expressed views is against who he is as a person, right? As a black man.
Fundamentally.
Right, exactly. And so, what he does is courageous. And through his conversations, through his attempts to understand where people are coming from, he's convinced hundreds of them to hang up their robes. Now, when he goes to lunch with them, he doesn't say, "You're a monster and an idiot." He says, why do you, let's discuss, what's your personal feelings about this? And one thing that these KKK members often talk about, and they don't know many black people, obviously, right? He's like maybe the first black person they've had lunch with. And they say, well, I just know that black men are like genetically more violent, and that's why there's black men in prison. I'm just like afraid basically for my family. And then Daryl's like, well, look at me, right? I'm a black man. And like, let's really, talk about those beliefs, not in like a aggressive way, but just in a like, let's just reconcile your perspective and experience of me now with those beliefs that you had, taught you as a kid. And he recognizes, right, that they are motivated by protection, right? They're motivated by like protecting from what they see as like violence. And then they realize that he's not violent. And then they extend that to other people, of his race. And then they hang up their robes, right? It's a long process, but he's done hundreds of these kind of deconversions. And so I think that's an important thing for folks to keep in mind, that it's like the way you bring people alongside you is by being open to their humanity and by understanding their desire for protection.
Yeah, and you kind of outline this as the Civ framework, that you connect, you invite, and then and like we just talked about, you validate. And I think that it's fantastic framework for how to have hard conversations, I think, and Daryl Davis being a pretty extreme example, right? For most of us probably won't be going into that big of a disconnect.
Right. Yeah. So, but I think his inspiration is useful even for everyday conversations, right? Like if Daryl's willing to talk to KKK members, like you might want to talk to your neighbor or your coworker or,
your uncle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Your uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? And the Civ framework that you mentioned, right, is something that I tried to extract and kind of like put together from conversations with folks who are actually bridging divides. John Saruf at Essential Partners. I should add a plug that he has a guide for talking about politics across disagreement. It's great. But he's really a pioneer in the space. And through talking with him, came the Civ framework. And as you say, Civ, the beginning of civil conversations, CIV, connect, invite, validate. And the beginning of that connect is really, understanding that John says, conflict flattens us, right? Makes us
I loved that.
And connecting is just recognizing before you talk about politics, like just the richness of us, right? Like people care about music and food and their family and travel and right? There's 100 things you could talk about that are not politics. Like maybe someone loves taking pictures of space. Maybe someone loves mushrooms. Like, I don't know. People have random stuff they care about,
Yeah. And we are complex beings, right? That have a variety of interests that transcends politics.
Exactly. We contain multitudes.
Yes.
And so connecting is really just a chance to showcase that you do and they do, and to kind of like connect with some of those similarities that are not about politics. And so once you recognize that each of you is like a human being, which is, it seems crazy you need to do, but we need to do that in today's world. Well, first I should say the way to really bring that out is to ask questions. And when people think of someone who's good at conversations, they think of someone who talks a lot, but really people like those who ask questions. Like imagine you're on a date and like all your date does is just talk about themselves, and you're not like, wow, they're amazing. You're like, they're a jerk, and self-absorbed. So
we want to be listened to and heard.
Exactly. And the crazy thing about these questions is people like being asked deeper questions than they think. This study blew my mind. I love this study.
I actually, and I have a quote pulled about this. So please talk about this because I loved this too.
All right, and Nick Epley is a friend of mine. He's at the University of Chicago, and he gets people to have conversations on the train in from the suburbs into Chicago, and he doesn't force them, but he assigns them to ask these deep questions to other commuters, and the questions are things like, I don't know, when's the last time you cried? What are your hopes for the future? Who's your first love? How do you think you're going to die one day? I mean, like if someone asks you these questions, you're imagining it. You're like, this is insane.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't want to talk to these people. But it turns out people love talking about these things and connecting as human beings. Like there's only so much you can talk about the weather, or like the latest sports ball results,
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Well, and one of the things I want to preface for listeners is that when the commuters were polled at the beginning of this, they reported that they don't want to talk to people, that they would prefer not to talk to their neighbors on the train. And then afterwards reported that they had these wonderful conversations, and I loved this. I pulled the whole quote series from this because I think it's really important that we do want to have profound and deep conversations, and would be surprised at our own enjoyment at getting to do so. I mean, I've made a whole hobby of it.
Right. I mean, what are podcasts about?
Yeah, that's all that this is.
Right. Deep questions. Right. But every person wants to have this experience. Right. And it sounds crazy. You're at the airport lounge and you're talking to someone about like something deep, but like it doesn't take long for people to warm up and get excited about it. All right. So that's connect, right? Ask people questions, get to know them as a human being, and then invite. And invite is, inviting someone to a party. You're like, would you please come? But really it has to seem optional. And I
viewed it vampirically. That a vampire must be invited into your home, right? That they can't just enter.
Exactly.
So broaching these conversations is sort of vampiric in nature.
Yeah, I love that. I love vampires, and I love that idea. It's exactly so. And but you have to like mean it, right? Like I got an email from someone who read the book in Australia, and she said, I love the framework. I have a neighbor, and he voted for someone different, and but like the framework didn't work because like basically I invited him and he didn't like play ball. And I was like, oh, interesting. Like what, how did you invite him? And she says, well, I invited him to explain why he supports mass murder.
Yeah.
Wow. Is that an invitation or like yeah.
It's an instant judgment. Yeah, it's that exactly. It's that instant judgment, the invitation coming from a place of genuine warmth, of wanting you to, or maybe not warmth, but at least genuine inviting you in and not offending you, not putting in your face first, if we're continuing on the vampire analogy.
Curiosity, understanding, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I think more like, oh, Kate, it's been great chatting. And I know there was just an election and, it was like super contentious. And I know there's been lots said on cable news and social media about these different positions. And I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in you. I'm interested in your thoughts and why you voted differently than I did. And I just love to hear your kind of personal experiences that led you to those beliefs. And so if now's not the right time, that's totally okay. But just know that I'm interested.
Yeah. And I love that piece. There's an out.
Mm-hmm.
There's that genuine curiosity, and there's that invitation.
Right. And so people are usually pretty happy, if your posture is one of understanding to kind of talk about yourself. And then this maybe gets back to the paradox of vulnerability, which we can get after the V. And the V is validate, right? Like validate is well, I guess this is the paradox of vulnerability, right? We know telling personal stories is so powerful to bridge divides, right? But in some sense, telling these personal stories is very vulnerable. Yeah. And it's like baring your neck to someone that you're worried is going to be a predator.
Yeah, and it opens us up to judgment, and judgment makes us feel like we're not a part of the group, and that brings up all of our prey fears.
Exactly, right. So the paradox of vulnerability is that stories and opening yourself up are so effective at bridging divides, but it's also threatening to us. And so when you've invited someone to share their vulnerable experiences, and they do, like now their neck is bared, and they're now we're like a vampires on the brain. Now their neck is bared, and like they're wondering what's going to happen, right? Or you're like pointy fangs going to come out, and so you need to convince them that that's not what's going to happen, right? Because that's not how these civil discourses go. And so you need to validate, and it doesn't mean agree, like we said before, right? It doesn't mean agree. It just means, thanks for sharing that. I understand it's probably hard to share it because, we're so divided today, but I really appreciate hearing where you're coming from. And it makes sense based on your experiences, why you vote this way or why you believe that. And it's different than I believe, but I appreciate knowing where you're coming from. Like, that's what a validation is. It's not an agreement. And I think that, that's the CIV. And I think that's useful for kind of having these conversations.
Yeah, I think it's really profound. And I didn't pull the study, but did you read Jim Milzaki's Hope for Cynics?
I did, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I was thinking about there's a piece in the book where he talks about that most of the time we don't think that we're going to walk away from these conversations feeling good or having been glad that we had them, but surprisingly most people do walk away from some of these tougher conversations with a deeper sense of connection and having been glad that we had the opportunity to connect.
Yeah. I mean, I teach a class at UNC for seniors, and there's 40 kids each semester, and part of the class is learning how to have these conversations, and then they go out into the community and they talk with roommates, sometimes strangers, sometimes grandparents. I had one student talk to her white grandparent, and she's like half black, and her grandpa is white, and she went and talked with him about like race in America.
Wow.
And contentious stuff.
Yeah.
And she reported back that no one's ideas were changed, but they felt closer together and more kind of respectful and sympathetic where the other person's coming from. And so I think, these conversations are almost always positive if you approach them in the right way. And at worst, typically neutral. You leave where you started, but I think they're usually a great learning experience.
Yeah, and I was struck, and I'll bring us back, and I know we need to wrap up here briefly, but I'll bring us back to that sort of paradoxical quality of being a prey animal that I really was struck by, that it is that we're a prey animal, that we perceive threat, but because we're a prey animal, we had 4 million years of human evolution of cooperating and communicating that actually brought us to this space where we are today, where we perceive so much threat in, and here's another paradox, in one of the safest times to have ever been alive. And so it is that same prey animal that can kind of bring us back to that cooperative or at least communicative aspect of things.
That's right. We do rely on other people to thrive, right? And we're happy. This is the other motivation for why to have these conversations, right? Like, we're happiest when we can connect with others and feel like we're part of a group in our family, in our workplace. And so sitting by yourself, raging on social media is like not the pathway for happiness, and flourishing. Instead, it's being in a community where you understand others and feel seen by others too.
Yeah, and I actually, in closing, I think that there's something to be said. We talk a lot about community on the podcast and how to build it. I mean, it's kind of one of my core missions. And I think that online, and you really detail this, and I wonder, just a nugget for people, the online community is very different in the way that we take in, first of all, a massive volume of perceived threat, and in the way that we respond to others, since we don't have those more intimate conversations, that we can just be keyboard warriors, as it were.
Right. Yeah.
Would you mind just touching briefly on that, just to give us a little bit more context of why maybe this is more contentious, as we are safer than we've ever been, ostensibly?
Right, exactly. We are safer than we've ever been. You're unlikely to walk out your door if you live in America, especially, right, and really come to harm. But we're still like perceiving a lot of threats, and especially because social media is fine-tuned to make us feel threatened. And I guess the example or the analogy I'll make for social media is that it's kind of like a Godzilla movie. And so,
I love those.
social media has a limitless supply of threats, right? And so every post is like this like screaming roar of a monster in the distance, right? But it also, there's virality metrics on each post, and it elevates ones that are already viral. And so you're basically seeing thousands of people screaming at you, running your direction after this monster roar, right? And so you can't help but think, oh my goodness, I need to get up. I need to scream. I need to run. And our minds are just not built to be this kind of panicked every day. And really, it's a moral panic, because the way we respond to those things is not to run away, but to express outrage, right? Express outrage online and like yell and call the other side names, because we think that's going to change things. But of course, it doesn't change things, because these platforms, are not for constructively engaging across differences, right?
No, not how they were built.
Exactly. And, we have some data that shows that if you use social media for politics and you pay attention to virality metrics, your symptoms of PTSD are like above clinical threshold. And so,
wow, fascinating.
Crazy, right?
Crazy. Yeah, crazy.
Right. Crazy. And so I think, not to say that you need to get off social media entirely, but I think just be very deliberate in like how you're engaging, and just know that if you're like diving into moral panics every day, it's not gonna be healthy for you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's not what our brains were built for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. We need offline communities. We need connection, and right. We need ways to build that, and that's what we're both about.
Yeah. And I just want to thank you. I know we're kind of coming to a close. I want to thank you. I really do think this should be required reading. And I was surprised at how much I learned, again, on that sort of personal micro level and at that macro level, and how much I enjoyed listening to it with my husband, where we could have these conversations in situ as we read through the book. I just think it's fantastic. And I'm really grateful for you writing it and sharing it with us and doing the research that you do.
Well, I appreciate the kind words, and I'm glad it was useful. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it's about. Kicking off discussions and conversations. We need more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kurt, thank you so much. I'll have all your links in the show notes to the books and to your foundation, and we'll direct people to you there.
Great. And the book website is like outragedbook.com, and there's like giveaways and stuff there. So
awesome. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good spot, because then there's guides that people can have, and there's like a tool that people can use to like. I feel like I didn't do a good enough job of like getting the word out there at the website, but there's like, you can use this guide to help you have better conversations. So hopefully that's useful for folks.
I love that, and we'll have the Saruf guide to talking politics on there as well. Everything that was mentioned, so that people can have that, because I do think that. I mean, we need a toolbox. We've kind of lost this muscle of how to do this, and we need this toolbox, and you're giving that to us. So we'll have links to all of that.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right, All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right, All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.